it's just Martine, and 6 years ago, I gave a book 2 stars, and I'm going to see what do I think of it now. The book in question won a Pulitzer Prize, which I find hard to believe since I gave it 2 stars. Just kidding, for some reason, Pulitzer Prize winners have not always been hits with me. Yeah, I read this back in high school, right around the time when I was getting back into reading a lot more. I never fell out of love with reading, but I did stop doing it as often. So I read this book around the time that I was getting more into it again. And if I'm remembering correctly, I listened to the audiobook. And we all know audiobooks are not my favorite way to ingest a story. So when my major professor loaned me this book, I was like, I'm gonna give it another shot. What actually happened is I was like, that's an interesting title. So she lent it to me, and then I promptly realized I'd already read it. But at least I thought, hey, this makes for an interesting video concept, especially because if I did listen to it on audiobook, which I'm like 80% sure I did, then I missed a lot of visual information in this huge PowerPoint section. So we're going to see, how does this hold up 6 years after I read it? Have my reading tastes changed? Is it better when it's not audiobook? Is it better when it's now instead of then? Let's find out. I'm almost 2 chapters into this book, and here are my initial impressions. I didn't think I was going to remember anything from this book, but I do have to say that I remember Sasha. Yeah, Sasha and her, like, stealing issue. We kind of open this book with Sasha in therapy, talking to her therapist about why she feels inclined to steal things from people, and that does ring a bell to me. But then we got introduced to our other character, Benny, and, like, part of his stuff felt familiar, but a lot of it didn't. Like, I didn't have memories of it. I don't know. But so far I am curious. That being said, I remember that when I listened to this the first time, the beginning was pretty intriguing, but then it lost me along the way. So I think with this one, what's going to be interesting is maybe not my initial impression. It's going to be what happens the further into this book that I get. If only I would make time to read it. But, you know, we'll get around to it eventually. I am officially halfway through this book, and I can tell you at this point why I hated this the first time I read it. So I already told you that I listened to it on audiobook and that might be something that I held against it. But as I've been reading this and I've been taking in the writing style, I've come to the conclusion that this is the type of writing style that makes for a terrible audiobook. The timeline is all over the place. We're following different characters basically every chapter, and every chapter has a slightly different voice or way that it's written. In essence, it's very jumpy in the way it's written, and that's fine while reading it with my eyeballs, but it's the type of story that I cannot comprehend when I'm listening to it. So I would honestly be very surprised if I give this a 2 stars when I finish it in a few days, because so far I'm enjoying it. It's not going to be my new favorite book, like we're not going from a 2 to a 5 star here, but it is pretty interesting. It's just incompatible to be read as an audiobook, particularly if you have the difficulties with audiobooks that I do. I don't pay the best attention to audiobooks sometimes. Like, a book has to be better if it's an audiobook to keep my attention than a book I'm reading with my eyeballs has to be to keep my attention, if that makes any sense. And there are markers on pages that signal to you when things are changing that maybe you don't always get in an audiobook, and that can be frustrating and confusing. I'm still not sure I know what the point of this book is going to be. It feels kind of like we're just jumping to different interesting characters, which is a totally fine concept for a book to me, but I am interested to see what happens in the second half. Like, will it come together in a specific way? I don't know, and I certainly don't remember, so I think it will be interesting. But I have to finish this soon because it's my professor's book, and I'm leaving for home for the summer on Tuesday, and it's Saturday, so, you know, things have to happen soon, is what I'm saying, so that I can return this book to her. I just finished reading A Visit from the Goon Squad, and wouldn't you know it, I gave it 4 stars. It's still not perfect to me, but it is actually a really good book. So I wanted to discuss not only what it's about, because I've neglected to tell you this whole time, I guess, but also why, aside from the fact that I listened to it on audiobook originally, I think it worked this time around for me when it didn't work the first time I read it. Basically, this book is about a ton of people. The back says it's about Benny and Sasha, but it's really not. I would say those two are kind of the starting points. Like, the first 2 chapters are about them, and then we get connected to other people through them. So this book is really about a lot of different characters all of which are somehow involved with one another, and most of which are involved somehow in the music scene. It does wrap up like nicely. The end and the beginning do connect, but overall, it's much more like reading, I would say, a series of related short stories than a novel, although it does feel cohesive in some ways. I don't know, it's really hard to describe in that way, which I think is one of the biggest contributions to why this did not work the first time I read it. One, because I read it on audiobook, and I feel like that style of storytelling does not translate to audiobook, particularly because there were times in which I was like, that name seems familiar. I think they're trying to reference somebody we'd met earlier in it, and I'd have to flip back and like scan for the name to find out why they mattered, basically. And I couldn't do that with the audiobook, right? But also one thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this is how my reading has changed over the past 6 years. I think I've grown a lot more comfortable with not fully understanding all the time where a story is going or what exactly is happening in a given moment. I'm more willing to stand back and wait for the larger picture to appear. And I'm also more open to non-traditional types of storytelling, like taking a set of connected characters and focusing different chapters on them in types of character studies. I've always said I care more about characters than plot, but I think as I've grown up in my reading, I've understood more what that can look like. And I think this is a good example of it, in which there are very rich, interesting characters that are well built. And is there a plot? Not really. There are themes, I would say, but I hesitate to say that there's a real plot. And so I think in some ways it's the type of book that I'm a lot more open to understanding and appreciating now than I was at the end of high school. I think this is the case for many reasons. One, I've read a lot of books in between the end of high school and now. When I read this book 6 years ago, it would have been 2018, so I was a senior in high school. I had just really gotten back into intensely reading all the time. And now I've been intensely reading nonstop for 6 years. And I think that's helped me in a couple of ways. One, in understanding some about maybe non-traditional types of storytelling, but also made me more interested in non-traditional types of storytelling because I've read a lot of traditionally written stories. I also think this time I went in seeing like, it's the winner of a Pulitzer Prize. It's won all of these different things, right? And asking myself, why? What are people seeing in this? Which I think is a very different approach to reading a book than just randomly selecting the audiobook to listen to and going through it. In some ways, I feel like this did better because this time I went in with the mission of seeing if I could get something from it, not just to read it and be done with it. And I will say, typically I go into books just to read them and to be done with it. Although I would say I've reflected in the past 6 years a lot on why reading matters to me. And so in some ways, maybe I am looking more closely at why different stories matter, but I can't say with confidence that that's the truth. So in some ways, I understand why I liked this book better this time than I did 6 years ago. But on the other hand, there are things that I don't understand about myself and my circumstances that might have contributed to different feelings both then and now that will always maybe be a mystery to me. So yeah, I don't know. Basically, the point of this experiment is asking, given 6 years, can a book feel different than it did? And the answer is yes. I mean, I feel like books can feel different even from day to day because our circumstances change and that changes how we interact with literature. But 6 years definitely changes how we see books. So I'm glad I gave this experiment a shot. And thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below, is there a book that you think you might like now that you did not like when you first read it? And subscribe for more bookish and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye.